Yeah. Hi, I'm Sverre Raffnsøe, Professor of Philosophy at Copenhagen Business School and Institute of Advanced Study Fellow at the Collegium de Lyon, affiliated with the École Urbaine de Lyon and the École Anthropocène de Lyon. And a warm welcome to you, Dipesh Chakrabarty, Lawrence A. Kimpton, Distinguished Service Professor of History and South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. You're also a recipient of the 2014 Toynbee Prize and the 2019 Tagore Memorial Prize. Maybe also a couple of additional prizes, I don't know. But I'm very happy that you agreed to take part and contribute to this series of talks on the Anthropocene. As in previous cases, we've met to invite the listeners into the much discussed Anthropocene, a new possible geological epoch in which we may already have arrived. You can like it or not, or you can know it or not. It's a new epoch that possibly follows and replaces the 11,700-year-long old Holocene, or most recent epoch. But it's also an age that, according to some, distinguishes itself from all previous eons in the 4.5 billion long history of the Earth. Since it's the epoch in which the impact of collective human activity has acquired paramount importance, and in which human activity has decisively affects geological sedimentation and also the entire Earth system. Heralded as a new epoch, distinguishing itself from all foregoing eons in the history of the Earth, the Anthropocene forms the common denominator for a wide array of realizations that an all-decisive threshold in the history of the Earth and human mankind is being crossed. Human activities are gaining overarching importance and are beginning to play a dominant role in key processes in the Earth system. The balance now seems to have shifted such that humankind can no longer conceive of itself as a minor or inferior being living within a larger globe or cosmos. The human factor has become a major and probably decisive factor in future developments. The Anthropocene is also the anthropogenic era, or the time and world in which what happens, as well as what it affects, are to a large extent influenced by human activity. Now, whether one understands the Anthropocene as a new geological chronostratigraphic unit or a decisive threshold event, no discussions concerning that, the significance of human beings in the Anthropocene concomitantly proves to radically alter the material conditions of subsistence for human beings in ways that may at first glance seem startling and ironic, and maybe even antagonistic and antinomic. Whereas the Holocene, the hitherto more recent geological epoch, during which the human species proliferated and spread worldwide, seems to have climatically been the most stable period in the history of the Earth so far, the Anthropocene is characterized by a new accentuated instability and unpredictability that we have already entered, I think. And as global warming makes it graphic, human significance affects the home planet of human beings so drastically that not only heat and drought, but also high water may come. In consequence of human influence, you can say the ground on which humankind has stood is quaking, and the sky may also seem to be falling on our heads. And beginning to congratulate themselves with finally being allotted this principal part at the center stage of the local scene, the human actors suddenly also seem to become affected and troubled as they discover that somebody is drawing the curtain to reveal a much larger and more complicated scenery. And here they realize that they must share the action with the scenography, or what they considered as a scenography, since the various elements of what they used to consider as the environment of their performance begins to play an active part. But today we met to discuss the Anthropocene, but also to primarily focus on one main aspect of the Anthropocene that I just touched upon, anthropogenic climate change as the biggest threat to human civilization, the biggest threat humanization has ever faced, and its wide-ranging implications for historical understanding and for the understanding of what it is to be a human being. For a number of years, the question of anthropogenic climate change has spurred you on, Dipesh, and you've been one of the most influential scholars addressing the significance of climate change as a planetary crisis upsetting and endangering human life and life forms to the extent that it may be threatening them with extinction, but also as a major game changer in a number of regards, since it upends sort of the long-standing and cherished ideas of progress, of modernity, of globalization, as well as well-established conceptions of history and historical development. In 2008, you published the article, The Climate of History, 4 Theses in Critical Inquiry, which proved to be an agenda-setting contribution to the subject, eliciting a number of responses across disciplines to the radical implications, and further developing the radical implications of the 4 theses. In 2015, you delivered the Tanner Lectures in Human Values at Yale University, later published under the title The Human Condition in the Anthropocene. In 2019, you published The Crises of Civilization, Exploring Global and Planetary Histories with Oxford University Press, a collection of essays that explore the significance of planetary climate change for humanistic and post-colonial thought. And the essay also develop how the crisis of climate change demands not only critiques of capitalism and inequality, but also new thinking about the human species as a whole, and about our patterns and conceptions of justice, our writing of history, and our relationship with nature in the age of the Anthropocene. And finally, this year, you published the masterly The Climate of History in a Planetary Age with University of Chicago Press. And here, insights and perspectives come together also from a lot of your previous work and are further developed in most interesting ways, I find. It's a most recommendable work that's also likely to play a major role in the future, but also will play a major role of course, in this interview. And one reason why your contribution remains so stimulating, so wide-ranging, but also agenda-setting, is that you not only draw on your background as a historian and as a social theorist, but also on a number of other disciplines or areas such as philosophy, geology, earth system science, political theory, subaltern studies, as well as on your own personal experience from around the world and from around the globe. Now, after this a bit lengthy presentation of the subject and a few, I'd like to start by asking you, how did you come to take an interest in this climate change and global heating, in this subject? And what prompted your interest, and what made you continue to study this issue or predicament personally, and also as a participant in the public debate and as a scholar?
Well, I mean, one root of my interest in the problem, one source was autobiographical. But I can't separate the autobiographical from the intellectual because they come together. Yeah. But sometimes, so what happened was I went to Australia in my 20s to do PhD work. And, I grew up in Calcutta, which is a very built-up city, right? I mean, if you want to look for nature, then you either go to a film theater to see it on screen, or you look up to the sky. Nature was something, or you find it in poetry. So there's a lot of poetry in Bengali, a lot of nature in Bengali poetry, because a lot of writers actually historically came from the countryside. They grew up in the countryside, knew the countryside, but they were urban, but they wrote about the countryside. But I was totally urban. I was born in Calcutta. And then when I in Australia, I went to the city that was the opposite of Calcutta, Canberra. It was small. So I went from a city of then maybe 10, 15 million people to a city of 200,000 people. And Canberra was built in a very interesting way, so that what the Australians call the bush, it goes through the city. So if you live in Canberra, then you can only walk, for half an hour, and you're on a hill and in the bush. And so I actually fell in love with that, with nature in Canberra. most Australians love to hate Canberra because they would rather be in Sydney or Melbourne, big cities. But I came from a big city, so I came to love the small city.
Yeah.
And you know, then and Australia I knew because of the gum trees. The gum trees need fire for regeneration.
Yeah.
So Australia has cyclical bushfires, wildfires.
Yeah.
But in 2003, there a horrible bushfire which kind of destroyed 300 houses, killed some people, and destroyed all the natural spots around the city I used to love. And I was very bereft. I was in mourning when I saw the result of it. And I was asking my friends, Australian friends, particularly environmental historian friends, saying, and why was this fire? Why is the drought so bad? And they had a 10-year-long drought. And people said to me, this was 2003, this is climate change, not an ordinary drought. And, I didn't know anything about climate change. In fact, you'd be interested to know that a respected Harvard historian, Charles Meyer, wrote an essay in the American Historical Review in 2000, last issue perhaps, and it's called Consigning the 20th Century to History. So saying goodbye as a historian to the 20th century. And he surveys the 20th century. He mentions everything about the 20th century except global warming. So even though the IPCC had been formed by the late 1980s and they were publishing, historians hadn't heard about them. Historians were talking about globalization, not global warming. So when my friend said it's climate change, I said to myself, what is climate change? And I began to read up. And when I began to read up on climate change, I was very struck by the idea that humans with their technology and numbers acted like a geophysical force. That humans were a geological agent. And you see, I'd grown up as a postcolonial historian. I used to be interested in anti-colonial movement, human freedom, human rights, citizens' rights. And the word agency in history had a Lockean understanding that it was about being autonomous, being proactive, being able to project yourself out in the world. But geological agency, the word agency and geological agency was a very different word. And I thought, wow, what is this? How can humans be a geological agent? And then as I was reading, I realized that we now have we are capable of having an impact on the planet that would be like an asteroid strike. Whatever it was that killed off the dinosaurs. We are
as has been the case previously.
That kind of a force.
But is it correct to say that there was this personal experience of enjoyment of nature, meeting nature, and then this sense of derailment and shock that out of a sudden something happens that I don't understand and that strikes me in a sense?
Well, I should tell you that I was always interested in geology because geology was in my undergraduate student. It was one of the subjects I studied. So my old interest in geology for me, when I went to Australia to do my PhD, I used to miss India and miss Calcutta. And I used to think to myself, if I were a geologist, the whole world would be my book to study. I would not be homesick. I would be at home everywhere. But because I was in Australia studying India, I was constantly reading things that were reminding me of home. So there was a certain kind of sadness about studying India outside of India.
A certain sense of exodus.
Later on, it helped, but initially I was quite homesick. I was nostalgic, and I used to say to myself, because Australia was geologically very interesting. And I used to say, why didn't I become a geologist? Then I would be at home anywhere. I wouldn't miss India because any place would be interesting. So I had an interest in geology. So then when I began to read about it, so it immediately challenged many of the assumptions of the humanist kind of history I used to write.
Yeah.
So as I thought about it,
Yeah.
my initial thoughts became the four theses. Because it was easy to organize my thoughts in the thesis form.
Yeah.
Because then I could quickly say, hey, here are the four problems I'm having.
Yeah.
So and initially when I wrote it, I first wrote it up in Bengali for a Bengali magazine in Calcutta.
Okay. Yeah.
And nobody was interested.
Okay.
And they said to me, Western people think about these things. This is not what we think about. This is Western. You're bringing American problems into our discussion.
Yeah.
So it just sank.
In that sense, it's been a long way coming, hasn't it? And then when I came back to America, non-recognition, at least,
of the problem, absolutely. And that actually that gave rise to another theoretical question, which I'll discuss with you later on. Why were my fellow Bengalis so uninterested? That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
So and that becomes significant in respect of what I'm going to say now. So then I came back to America.
Yeah.
And I was then on the editorial board of Critical Inquiry, and the main editor, Tom Mitchell, came to me and said, "We are short of articles. You have something you can give to us."
Yeah.
So I enlarged it. I wrote it up in English.
Yeah.
And it got published. And then not friends in India, but friends in Europe, friends in Latin, everyone was interested. I mean, the article got translated, it got debated. People disagreed with it, people agreed with it, people thought it was good, people thought it was bad. But it was not like the non-response I had in India. And
it didn't think it was picked up, and there were a lot of
and that later on, that is something I've reflected on, why that happened. But so then this work started, and I initially thought I would write a book elaborating the four theses. But in the meanwhile, my article was one of the first in the humanities to broach the problem. Late, because IPCC is 1988. This is 2009, so many decades. But historians were laggards. So, but the interesting problem, which was an interesting challenge, was that there was no model book for this. So, I was not writing a history of capitalism. If you write a history of capitalism, you can think of Brodel or you think of Marx, even many models. But I had no model. So I realized that I have to make my own way. And basically, the Tanner lectures you talked about, you see, what happened was I took a turn, and then I realized that there are some dead ends here. So I would take another turn. So my thoughts were evolving. So for instance, I was very, initially I worked with the idea of the Anthropocene a lot. But then I realized that for humanists and social scientists, the Anthropocene was giving rise to a debate about whether it should be called Capitalocene, whether it should be called Plantationocene. And increasingly I found the debate getting sterile. Because people were saying the same thing over and over again. You must blame capital. Species is you should, you're not no undifferentiated humanity. So after a while, I thought
that was a deliberate move on your part.
I thought this is getting me into a dead end and into a topic that is not challenging my thoughts. Because I knew about capitalism, I knew about Marx, I knew about. The Marxists were not teaching me anything new. And I thought, okay, if I follow the Marxists, I'll make them happy, but I wouldn't be challenging myself.
That was already an essential part of your background, of course.
Exactly. I mean, it's familiar. It's a familiar territory. So that's why I was trying to struggle to see how I can reposition the issues. And in the Tanner lectures, I was trying to, in the Tanner lectures, you can see I was trying to move to a Hannah Arendtian problem of the human condition, which stayed with me. And eventually I realized, see, through my work, initially I was working with the two expressions, globalization and global warming. And my own thinking, and as well as some of the writing and also a conversation with the French philosopher Catherine Malabou. Malabou.
Yeah.
So that she made the point somewhere, and I was getting to that realization, but she made it. She said, the word globe in global warming means something different from the word globe in globalization.
Yeah, so that was in a sense misleading then. Yeah.
And as I worked through that, then I realized that I have to evolve a distinction between the globe and the planet.
Yeah.
So my work was moving in that direction, and that distinction became clear to me after I had finished my Tanner lectures. So Tanner lectures were 2015. So my journey begins in 2009. I spent a few years fighting with Marxists who were saying it's capitalism. And I think I'm not disagreeing, but it was not taking me very far.
Because at first you also received that kind of response and attack.
I did, and I thought I'm not disagreeing with you, and you were misreading me. And so it was. So then the human condition Tanner lectures was about human condition, and I was evolving after the Tanner lectures as I came back to this question of the difference between globalization and global warming. That distinction eventually I was able to recast as a distinction between the globe and the planet. So the planet became Earth system. So in a way, and that helped me. Once I made the distinction, my thoughts fell into place. And then
let's stay a bit with that distinction. Maybe you could develop this distinction a bit further.
Sure. You want me to? Okay. So what happened was, so I realized that. So I'll say two things. It is the last thing that I'll say first, but then I come back to the distinction. So the reason why I use the word planetary age, so in a way my argument became in the book, not as such about the Anthropocene, because the Anthropocene can be many million years old, right? If it starts now, the Anthropocene can even go beyond human history. I mean, even if the humans were to go extinct, Anthropocene would remain, right?
We could still have changed the climate,
right?
And that would stay even though we were no longer there.
I mean, my colleague David Archer says we have already changed the climate for 100,000 years. We may not exist for 100,000 years. So I brought the problem back into human history, and what I'm trying to say in the book, by calling it a planetary age, I'm trying to say we are no longer in just the age of globalization. Because today, when we are in the age of globalization, what were our main questions? Our main questions were immigration, race, racism, technology, the old debates about whether technology homogenizes human beings. The Gadamer kind of question, was technology bringing the world together too soon? Right? And not allowing people to appreciate cultural differences. So the fears of globalization, as well as the hopes of globalization, had to do with questions of anthropological difference. But today, whether we consciously think so or not, we talk about planetary processes when we talk about renewable versus non-renewable fuel. We are talking about the difference between planetary time and human time. When we talk about excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, when we talk about erratic weather, extreme weather events, when we talk about sea levels rising, acidification of the seas, we are so human. Even our everyday conversation, everyday newspapers are telling us that we are becoming aware of the planet, of planetary processes. And that's why I say, as a historian to human beings, I said, even within human history, while humans exist, we have moved into a new age. And that I call planetary. So I'm saying at the global age, we are in the twilight of the global age. And we are moving into a planetary age where experts are talking about how to manage this planet. And even if we're not going to manage it, we're going to become victims of it. Right? Climate refugees and all those things. So eventually I moved the debate away from whether or not we are in the age of the Anthropocene, because the age of the Anthropocene is not a humanist category. Because the Anthropocene can outlast humans.
Yeah.
But I was coming back to an immediate concern of the humans.
Yeah.
And I think the planet has become our immediate concern.
Yeah. So this is just this crucial experience that even within the planetary, we begin to experience something that is irreducible to human history as we knew it, at least.
Right. Exactly. It is still human history, but it is not reducible to the global history.
Yeah.
So so there the distinction. So once I made the distinction, I could say that, and the distinction was. I mean, as you know, basically my distinction was that when you speak about globalization, its main character, the character at the center of the drama of globalization is the human. Because if you talk about capitalism, technology, we are its creators. So human institutions, human activities are the center of the story. But when you talk about Earth system, then you realize that you are part of a system, or a system-like thing, which I'm calling the planet, which is absolutely indispensable for your life and your existence. But you are not indispensable to it. It existed without you. It can go on existing without you. Right? So suddenly, that's what I call the breakdown of the assumption of mutuality. That globalization happened, imperialism happened, capitalism happened, on the assumption that the Earth was there for us. And we will do what we want to do, and all other life forms will have to adjust to what we do. So if we want to eat more meat, we will produce more cattle. If we want to have chicken, so today, as you know, the broiler chicken
we'll modify the chicken.
And the most populous bird on the planet is the broiler chicken. There are 21 billion broiler chickens around.
It's also been suggested that as a characteristic of the Anthropocene.
Exactly. So our assumption was that this Earth is here and it's mainly for us. We can do what we want for our benefit, and others will adjust. And that is how we lived. Humans have really flourished in the last 150 years, like they've never before. But in the process, as we expanded our realms, began to dominate the order of life, the unintended consequence of our action was that it revealed the planet to us. Suddenly, through that process, we encountered what I'm calling the planet. And it was shocking because we realized that this entity we depend on critically does look back.
You described that as a shock, as something unintended, as something that takes us also back in a sense, but also produces a certain sense of falling or vertigo.
Right. Or being thrown. I mean,
That out of a sudden we realize something.
Well, I mean, the example I give in the book and also sometimes in classrooms. So I tell my students, think about it. We can't live without breathing. And that's because we are oxygen dependent creatures. And the share of the oxygen in the air is such that it is, if it goes up much higher, then everything will go up in flames. And if it goes down, then we will choke. So it has to be maintained. And because oxygen is a reactive gas, the Earth has to supply the air with fresh oxygen. All the time. So then I ask my students, how long do you think the planet has been doing this for? Of course, they don't know. And when I tell them that it's 375 million years, they're shocked. I'm shocked because I say to them, you realize that this air is critical for your life. But it was not meant for you only. Even we've been around for 300,000 years. So clearly this air was produced for other forms of life as well. And other forms of life keep this air going. So that is how I try to explain the idea of the planet, that the planet is this entity that you depend on, but it doesn't look back to you. Or the other way I explain it is by using a biblical idea. So I said, when the planet is angry, the planet reduces you to a creaturely life. So for instance, I mean, if you think, I mean, you know about this, of course, but so if Kant thought, as a philosopher, that the human project is to actually express our moral life rather than our animal life, our creaturely. But when you're faced with these huge expressions of planetary anger, fury, it reduces you to a creature that wants to survive. And my example I give now recently from the Australian firestorms of 2019-2020 is that in central Australia, where there's a desert, and there are many feral camels, wild camels. And it came to a point because of the drought and the fires that there was a water body, and the camels were competing with humans for the water. And the Australian government decided to kill 10,000 feral camels, 10,000 camels. And I said, when you're doing that, then you're just two animals competing for the same resource, water. It just so happens that you have helicopters and guns.
That one can kill the other. But
one can kill the other. But it's a purely creaturely competition. There's nothing Kantian in it. There's no Kantian moral project.
And nothing moral in that sense.
Nothing moral in that
sense. In a sense, it's pure survival, isn't it?
It's pure survival. And that's what I say. That when you're faced with the planet's anger, it's pure survival. The project of human politics is gone. You're just trying to survive. Thank God you've got technology. You can kill the camels. Right? But with the globe, you can imagine that there's a human political project of prosperity, of equality, of dignity, of justice, human justice. But with the planet, it's the limit of the political. In that sense.
And also, then you move outside this human-centered universe in a sense, because you're at the same level as every other creature.
And I think so. Actually, I go on to argue that going forward, humans have to look at themselves from both perspectives. From a perspective that helps you to address human inequality, human injustice. But also from a perspective that makes you realize that we come very late in the history of life. And life is maintained by forms of life that we normally consider inferior to ourselves. Small creatures, planktons, microbial microbes, bacteria. They are the foundation of life. And so if life is a multi-storied building, we're at the top floor, and these are the guys who are keeping the building going. Therefore, I end the book by saying that if in the course of flourishing, we have expanded the human realm so much so that we are now making the planet angry, then the principle of survival must be based on a principle of withdrawal. What form that will take is different. Right? But we can't go on expanding our domain. The way, because that's how we're getting the pandemic. The pandemic is a result of that kind of expansion.
In that sense, you can say that human civilization has become very self-important, but it's also become sort of a provocative existence that provokes all sorts of reactions and responses. And
so it is putting itself in danger. By expanding so much.
If you were to stay a bit with this global, this idea of process of globalization as you describe it, how would you describe this range and scope of this prolonged process of globalization that, as you put it, has made the sphere we live on turn into a globe?
So I think of to put it simplistically. I think of European expansion. I mean, or what Heidegger called the Europeanization of the earth. That project I see as having probably gone on from the late 15th century to, I would say, in places like India up to about 1960s. Even a little later, because the 20th century project of national liberation from colonial rule really finishes with Vietnam War. And then I would say the last bastion of that kind of emancipatory movement is the end of apartheid in South Africa in the 1990s. I mean, which is why Nelson Mandela is still the most exalted leader of the late 20th century. Because in him, the big themes of racism, imperialism, settler colonialism, they all come together, and emancipation, they all come together.
He kind of incarnates that.
He incarnates all that. So the big themes of 20th century kind of, I would say, die with Nelson Mandela's, Nelson Mandela, they've come into him. So I see this period of Europeanization of the earth having two functions. One of them, in my head, I call the world-making function, and a globe-making function. So the globe-making function is literally, I mean, the globe, literally it's a technological function, whereby technology, you bring people together. So it begins with deep sea going ships, to then railways, telegraph, telephone, electricity, aeroplanes, then the electronic age, to smartphones, computers, everything that connects us. Things that Peter Haff might call the technosphere. But this was a function, but the world-making function had both a destructive side and a very generative side. The destructive side was the nasty, brutish aspects of colonial rule. So some places they dominated, they ruled you, they skimmed money from your revenue. Some places, indigenous people, they took your land and made you suffer, destroyed your life, way of life. Some places they enslaved you because they wanted your bodies. And that's the nasty, racist, ugly side of Europe. But at the same time, there was the so-called scientific revolution. There was the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And there was also intellectual movements like liberalism, Marxism, feminism, all kinds of ideology of emancipation, rationalism, that we have often used to criticize European imperialism. Right? So if you think of, I was explaining this to another friend, that if you think of these 500 years of world history as a drama, and any drama, the most interesting character is the one that is the most contradictory character. Right? And Europe, in that sense,
is the contradictory
character. Most contradictory character, and that's why it's also the most fascinating character. It has both a good side and a bad side, a destructive side and a generative side. So, and that's what I call its world making, because in spite of spelling destruction of such big orders, it also created new disciplines, new forms of knowledge, which inspired non-European scholars too. I mean, one of the most learned scholars of Sanskrit language in India, end of the 19th century, early 20th century, is on record saying that while it is our language, the European method of studying it is the most scientific method. So we should learn from them how to study our own language. So people were inspired by the intellectual exchanges. This didn't happen everywhere. It happened mostly in places where the Europeans also created a middle class, a colonial middle class.
Like in India, for example.
Like in India. But it didn't happen, for instance, where they enslaved people at the same rate, or it didn't happen with indigenous people because they destroyed those societies. Right? So there it happened, but it happened later. I mean, Frantz Fanon is reading Merleau-Ponty and they're inspired by phenomenology, but that's 20th century.
Yeah, and then making active use of that.
Exactly. Whereas the Indian engagement with the Enlightenment begins in the 18th century. I mean, there are Indian intellectuals writing letters to European intellectuals, getting interested in republicanism, getting interested in because in India they actually developed a middle class. They created a university-educated class. My ancestors. So it is out of that kind of feeling that I wrote my earlier book, Provincializing Europe. But so globalization I see as the result of that process, the continuity of that process. So sometimes you can call it as a one worldist project, creating this feeling of one world. And for me, the ultimate point of that project is the picture of the blue marble, 1972. The astronauts look back and see the blue marble. That's the globe. Looked at from outside, and as you know, we discussed it by email. That
then as one world, you can say. But in that sense, globalization would be, or making the world a globe. One globe is a very sort of wide-ranging process that would start in the 15th century with European exploration of the world, also map making, Mercator, and having a lot of different objects linked to
creating new knowledges, explorations, etc. All of that part
linked to enlightenment, the idea of progress, the idea of mapping of the world, but also with the arts, for example, with the sort of appearance of landscape painting since the 15th century, which is also, as you said, suggested this idea of a spectator that arrives from without and takes a look at the landscape as a sort of as a picture.
And also those Dutch paintings, Rembrandt and other people who are collecting from the world. Pictures of Europeans who are collecting from the world. And sometimes the Europeans would actually, when they came to India, they gave the Mughal emperor, one of the Mughal emperors, the globe as a present. Literally, the globe as a present. And and the Mughal emperor didn't like it because his title said that he was the world emperor of the universe. And on the globe, he had a little part of it.
So he reduced in perspective as part of that.
He didn't like it. He said, take it back. I don't even have any use for this. But see, so all that I think as of the globe making and the world making aspects of globalization. But the planet is not something you can see with your eyes in the way that you can see the blue marble. Because the planet is the Earth system, which is an abstract construction. It's made up of satellite observation, deep sort of investigation of ancient air by boring into ice, computer modeling. It's an abstract system put together by scientists. And so it's like what Timothy Morton calls the hyper object. So you don't see it, but nobody sees the planetary climate system. Nobody sees it.
In that sense, viewing the Earth from the outside, as when people went away and then took these pictures, it's rather an instance of the globalism. It's the last landscape painting where you are able to rise above. It's like Scipio rising from above the world and taking a look at it from the outside, from this liminal existence, and also able to map it as an entirety, and maybe also having.
That is the thing. The Scipio example makes it clear that it is part of our phenomenological desires. I mean, the desire to fly is a desire to cross your phenomenological limits. The desire to be up there. Is a desire to cross. Cross your limits of phenomenological limits.
To rise above the world.
I often think that we Hindus imagine a goddess with 10 arms, or a god with 3 eyes, and I think those are all expressions of desire to cross your phenomenological limits as a human being. So you can't have 10 arms, so you imagine a god with 10 arms. So I think it was part of a phenomenological. It's realizing a phenomenological desire to be up there. and look at the planet and say, hey, it is really a globe. It looks like a sphere.
Yeah, and this is quite difficult to let go of, isn't it? Realizing that dream, there's a certain sense of fulfillment in it, and at the same time a bit of melancholy too, because then you're no longer part of the world, and you would like to go back and become part of it, I think, and interact with it. But then you enter into the planetary.
But that knowledge then gives you, that knowledge eventually gives you the knowledge of the planetary. Yeah, right. So that intellectually you can't get back to that globe. Yeah, right. You see it, but that absolutely. So that's what so in many ways, that's why I have a sentence there saying that the intensification of the global reveals to us the domain of the planetary. Yeah. So that's the sense, the further we go in that direction, maybe the more accentuated would be the experience then of the planetary. And the other thought that I had, which I write briefly I mention it briefly in the book, so most readers will probably miss it. But this was a thought actually inspired by reading a very interesting essay that Heidegger has on Plato's allegory of the cave. Yeah. So where Heidegger makes the point that once these people come out of the cave, and they see forms, they see a bird, a tree, but that which enables them to see forms has no form, which is light. So they don't see the light that actually enables them to see. Similarly, I also think that, when we talk about climate justice, we talk about democracy, whether we technically are able to demonstrate it or not, I think political thought actually is thinking about forms, is formal thinking. So, Rawls can actually write a book about justice, which is very formalistic. Yeah. Right? So when I say India is more democratic than China, I must have a form in my mind for democracy. Yeah. Right? So the planet, the globe is about forms, and forms are about politics. Yeah. Whereas, formal thinking, whereas the planet, about finding your bearings too. The planet has no form. Because the planet is just put together. So the planet is the non-formal condition for formal thinking. Yeah. In that sense, the allegory of the caves fits very nicely into what we discussed a few minutes ago, that this idea of rising above, getting this perspective, and then returning back and becoming part of So I actually found it quite productive to work through the category of the planet. Yeah. You also, at some point in the book, state that the process for globalization has become so all-encompassing that it begins to encounter its limits. It's that we are this arrival at this point in history where the global discloses to humans the domain of the planetary. Yeah. That's what I meant by it. That eventually, so you begin to almost also using Heideggerian terms, isn't it? Yeah, but Heideggerian terms, except that it is also a critique of Heidegger. Yeah. Because that's where I distinguish the planet from the earth, the world. The world, the Heideggerian words, because as I go on to say that in the Heideggerian vision of the human relationship to the earth, there is strife. There is kind of strife between us. Between world and the other. Yeah, world and other. Yeah. But there is also a mutuality where you can say that the earth greets me by rising as sap inside a tree and producing a fruit. So when I approach a tree, it is as if the earth is greeting me. It's rising up to the tree and greeting me. Yeah. That's what I call mutuality. But there is no mutuality with the planet. Yeah. So there's a sort of a bit of a human-centric view in Heidegger when he describes the world, because the world sort of speaks to me, and that's very clear. I mean, when you read about Dasein or when you read about Heidegger on language, it's very clear that he thinks that the world was waiting for a creature to come along that would have language, so that the question of being can be vouchsafed to that creature, right? So things existed before human beings, or before humans had language.
Yeah, that's it. They're waiting for us to come. And
but only when we had
give them
language.
Names and
or we could ask, what does it mean to exist?
Yeah.
So existence waited for us to come and ask, what does it mean to exist? In that sense, humans are special in Heidegger. There's no question. Even though he says that he's not a humanist, in that letter to Sartre, that his philosophy is not humanism. But I think Dasein is modeled on the human.
Yeah, definitely.
You can't.
It becomes weakened throughout the trajectory, but it's still there in a sense.
Particularly in Being and Time, because that's why it becomes weakened. I agree with you, and that's why he doesn't finish Being and Time. After the Kere or whatever, he just leaves that project and goes away. But when he first thinks about Dasein, he's saying it's not the human, but it's modeled on the human.
But one could also speak about the planetary as the end of that kind of worldview and the end of the cosmological worldview, in a sense, couldn't one? Then the world is no longer a cosmos, and we have been imagining it to be
a cosmos
since we sort of became part of the planet.
Yes, actually, I would say from the axial religions.
Actually, religions.
Including Hinduism.
And in particular, of course, with the start of early modernism, of course, then it becomes more and more accentuated. But
I think the big change also was, something I don't discuss explicitly in the book. The big change also was in political thought, because see, political thought begins by saying that that a function of politics is to protect human life and property, right? But the assumption in Hobbes is very interesting, that political thought is protecting you from other humans who can either take your life or your property, because politics begins when wild animals have already been banished. Because wild animals belong to the state of nature. Right? That's why with wild animals, it's all right to kill a wild animal because it will kill you otherwise. So they belong to the state of war of all against all. So when Hobbes imagined the state of politics, it already has banished wild animals. But what happens in the 20th century, from 19th to 20th century, is with the rise of public health measures, rise of medicine, coming of antibiotics, is that it also becomes the work of extending human lifespan, longevity, also becomes part of the political. So that if suddenly people get killed, we blame the state. And so the interesting thing, is that while in the 17th century, Hobbes is saying, or even the Enlightenment is saying, we should overcome the fear of wild animals and only fear the state. It becomes a political job of the state and the public health system to overcome the fear of death by pushing it as far away as possible. Which is what extension of lifespan is. And that's why, but see that, because that is done with the help of technology, medical technology. This is what you look at the pandemic and you see that we are entering an era of pandemics because of the expansion of our existence. We may see more pandemics, and we will increasingly depend on more and more vaccines. Because the idea that many people would die from a pandemic is just unacceptable. And that's not a bad thing in human terms. We enjoy longer lives, but in some ways, we've created a civilization in which we are increasingly dependent on technology, and therefore the temptation to find technological solutions to the crisis is very high.
But there is a certain circularity. You try to find a solution in the same places. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. By more expansion. So
in the same place as what has created the problem. Since
exactly. So there's a tension now. So if you say that it is the expansion of the human domain that is causing the problems, and the solution should be to withdraw. Instead, some people will come along and it will always seem more practical to expand even more.
Yeah.
In order to solve the problem. But the problem is that the world of microbial life is something we can't quite manage. And we are actually getting into that life. So in the last 20 years, 75% of the new infectious diseases are so-called zoonotic diseases. They've come from wild animals to us. Even as bacteria and viruses, and wild animals don't go around looking for humans. They are coming close because we are pushing them out of their habitat. Right? But the fact that we try to then manage the crisis with vaccinations and don't think of long-term withdrawal will get us into more and more trouble, because it's like it's a technological society that will keep gambling on technology.
And in that sense, zoonotic diseases and also the COVID situation is here to stay. That would be your claim, wouldn't it? And
well, I mean, it's not my claim.
It's something of our own making to a certain extent that then comes back to haunt us.
In fact,
could one speak of the COVID situation as expression of the planetary, in a sense?
Both planetary and the global at the same time, because so actually this is best demonstrated by Anthony Fauci, who was the main medical person in Trump's time on infectious diseases. So last September, he and a colleague of his, David Morans, they published a paper, an academic paper together, and they were arguing, which some other infectious disease specialists are also arguing, that we have entered what they call an era of pandemics, where pandemics will happen with more frequency. And one basic reason is the destruction of forests. So they're saying we're building farmland, human habitations, mining in the forest, and that way we're forcing wildlife to come close to us. Now, so that's the part of globalization, right? So we are traveling more, we live in more crowded cities, we are growing in numbers. So we are a very good vehicle for the virus to travel. But so that's the global. The virus is becoming global through us. But the virus has lived in the guts of mammals like bats. And bats are a much older species. Bats have been around for 50 million years. So the virus is an old form of life. It used to have a local address in some bat's guts in China. Now it has a global address thanks to us. So we have actually created a new event in the history of biological life on the planet, because the virus is going to stay with us. We're going to get these shots. Some people will die every year from COVID-19, and we may have to live with more of these viruses. And the problem, the philosophical, historical problem here, I think, is that humans don't realize, or even if they realize, they don't act on that realization, is that humans are a minority form of life. The majority forms of life are microbial. And even our bodies, now that we know of the microbiome and everything, I mean, the bodies are like colonies, trillions of bacteria and viruses. So we are living the way that white South Africans lived at the time of apartheid. A powerful minority dominating a majority. Right? And that's what we are. So I feel we have to find. So this is where the planetary perspective may be helpful. It may help us to move towards practical forms of withdrawing. Sort of keep the benefits of globalization as much as we can, but also not be so expansive. Edward Wilson, the Harvard biologist, has a book called Half Earth, where he argues that we should just leave half of the land surface for other forms of life.
Yeah.
I don't know how to do that, but he has one practical idea. He said we should at least begin by returning all the national parks in the world, some 144 or something, of them to their pristine ecological state, because often humans have taken out capstone species of plants, of animals. He said return them, get them back to the way they were, and that in itself would help to revive biodiversity and take care of it. But that's one solution. But I find that the most dangerous temptation is to become even more technological, geoengineering, things. And I think those things will happen because they are a continuation of the logic of capitalist technology civilization. So those things will happen, but they'll bring more problems in their wake.
And they will also bring more problems because they're too simple. It's a too simplistic solution in a sense that doesn't take into account the dispersed agency that arrives also with the planetary.
Yeah, exactly, and also the unknowns of the planetary. It's temporal, it's time scales. How exactly. So
this total mapping of the world has become obviously impossible to make in a sense. It's been with the planetary, it becomes very pertinent that what you do affects and the responses has become very complicated matter.
Very complicated.
Yeah.
So my hope, though, as I say in the book, is that humans see the advantage we have. This is the advantage. One advantage we have is that we are always in an intergenerational situation. So humanity always means there are some old people and some young people. And the old people are more invested in the old systems than the young people are. So I joke and say that, look, my pension funds, which are all invested in the existing capitalist structure, they depend on the capitalist structure doing well. So it's very hard for me to, when I think of my retirement years, I think of my pension funds should do well. They should give me so that I'm not very poor or uncomfortable. But my students have not yet joined the system. So in many ways, the very fact that we have both young people and old people is actually something that gives you hope. Because the future is already with you in some form. And the other thing that gives you hope is that humans are a learning species. We learn. So even if we have a few misfortunes, it doesn't mean that we have to go on having misfortunes.
But you also mentioned a few minutes ago something that's also an obstacle, at least, or a challenge, when we want to leave the global and the globalized world behind, which is what some people would call the politics, biopolitics, and the politics of health. That we have created this agreement that we would take care of human health and develop human health and try to make our lives long and strong and also try to help one another fare well through life. This entire welfare contract, and which, by the way, also cuts across traditional politics and economics in a sense.
Absolutely.
And that's quite hard to leave behind, isn't it?
It is. But one hope is that that people say human population will stabilize. 10 billion, 9, 10 billion. Once it stabilizes, you can gradually plan to bring it down. So I think the first thing to have is eventually have a smaller human population. See, in 1900, we were 1.6 billion. So it took us almost 300,000 years to get to 1 billion. In 2000, we were 6 billion. So 1.6 to 6. Like 4 times. Then in in 20 years, we've added another 2 billion.
Yeah.
Right? So, but this fast growth, which is pushed along by our technological competence, that we are able to save lives, extend lives, all of these things. But once the population stabilizes, then we can, without being undemocratic, bring the numbers down. But it means, but this won't, it means that the next several decades are going to be critical in how we deal with climate change. These are the uncertain decades where we may suffer more. There may be more climate refugees. If we do geoengineering, it may cause wars, and there might be more conflicts. So we are getting into a period of uncertainty and danger. But my hope is that humans will learn. I mean, think of Europe. I mean, when I look at European history, I mean, Europeans were fighting so many wars, culminating in the 2 great wars. And it's only after fighting hundreds of years of warfare that the Europeans have become pacifist. Now when you go to Europe, it feels like the most civilized place, one of the most civilized places. But that civilization has come through hundreds of years of fighting. That realization that peace is important. A friend of mine, Stella Gervas, who is a historian in England now, has just published a book on European history called The Conquest of Peace, which is telling this story. But the Europeans have realized how fragile peace is, and therefore they value it.
And for a very long time, the European nations were among the most aggressive and among each other also.
With the others, exactly. When I look at European history, I kind of think, wow, what a violent bunch of people. Fighting everybody, dominating, doing all kinds of things. But that's what I mean. But humans have been like that with respect to other forms of life. We've been fighting them, killing them, destroying them. But in the process, we will have crisis, which would be the equivalent of the great wars in Europe. But by paying that price, we will learn. And because we are a learning species, I think we will go through some critical decades, but then hopefully learn and be able to give up on these attachments. It's very hard for my generation to give up the attachments because, what is my life? If you forget climate change, my life is a story of social mobility. Born in a very middle-class family. My father would not have been able to imagine the amount of money I make. Right? So if you didn't think of climate change, environment, then this is kind of the story of globalization. People are moving from poverty upwards, etc., etc. But that story doesn't hold because the price of that is precisely things like the pandemic and everything. So the more we pay the price, we will also there'll be debates about. That's why younger people who are not as invested in this story, they will be critical, and this is why it's very important for us to teach these things.
And in a sense, they have already become critical.
And actually, I see the change. All universities, even high schools, are now beginning to talk about climate change. I mean, Greta Thunberg. People had all kinds of criticisms of her, but one thing she managed to do was to put the issue out there for schools. And I think those sorts of things will need to happen. We need to go to the future generations and tell them that you can't really go on fulfilling your parents' expectations of success that they impose on you. When I look at, the Indian children of Indian immigrants who come to Chicago to study, their parents are always, because they have come here, they've made money, they become doctors, lawyers, engineers. They want the children to do the same because that's a model of success they know. It's rational for them to say, do these things, but these models will have to change. The generation that has benefited from these models of success is not in a position to change it.
Yeah.
But the generation that has not yet entered this, accepted this model, is in a position to change it.
Yeah, so that's in that sense, it's important to act before you become too embedded in. I believe you repeatedly state that we live at the cusp of the planetary and the global. Maybe you could develop that a bit.
Well, I mean,
it's quite crucial for your book, I think.
Yeah. So for instance, in the book, as I give the example, so one of the aspects in which we are both global and planetary, is that we are the biggest, technical terms, geomorphological agents. In other words, we change the landscape of the planet more than anything else. So we move more Earth around. And I give that example of the little boy playing, going past an earth-moving equipment machine, and then playing with toy earth-moving machinery, right? I mean, when his father, who's a colleague of mine, who very kindly gave me those photos, the story behind was that we had gone to their place for dinner, and they were showing, and as we were walking past their toys, the children's toys, and I said, these are Anthropocene toys.
Technical devices.
I mean, you're the little boy thinking this is what humans naturally do. They move Earth around. And actually, it's funny because an Indian friend's son, when he saw on the internet a picture that I used as a slide in a lecture, he sent me a picture of his son, young boy, little boy, playing with the same machinery in India. So, in a way, the planet
is global.
It's both global and planetary. So, it is our planetary role that we change landscapes. In the process of globalization, but it has also become part of our individual lives. So that's how we naturalize it. We naturalize it by make it into a toy, a plaything. And the child, in a way, that's how we learn to enjoy being planetary. Without knowing what its consequences are.
But it also seems in this picture of the cusp that the planetary and the global are coming together and meeting and beginning to intersect. But one could also say that
within individual life. Within individual.
But also within collective life, in a sense, it's both local and global in a sense. But one can also say it's kind of a chiasma because they lead and intersect, and then it's difficult keeping them together. When you move on, you have to follow either
they travel with you,
or the other logic because they don't really cohere. And I think that's also certainly a very important part of your book that you describe.
I mean, think of the container that blocked the Suez Canal recently. The big container. Now, these container ships they have to, in order to stabilize, they have to carry inside the body of the ship a huge amount of seawater for ballast to stabilize the ship. So when they go from one end of the world to another end, carrying their whatever they're carrying, oil tankers or whatever they're carrying, they then let that seawater out and take in fresh seawater. And in the process, they're transferring species by the thousands from one place to another. And they're producing a cocktail soup of species. So these shipping containers, they are global. They're part of the global economy, but they're performing a planetary role. In changing the history of life.
Because that's also one of the suggested criteria for the Anthropocene, isn't that invasive species and homogenization of biological life around the world.
So basically, phenomena happening on different time scales are coming together. Right. The destruction of forests may have taken let's say 100 years.
Yeah.
But the virus's life story is millions of years. Right? So the virus's life story, which is millions of years, and the destruction of forests 100 years, that's all coming together.
Yeah.
So events are both global and planetary. And that's what I mean by saying that we are on the cusp.
Yeah.
It's like one side of it is global, other side is planetary.
Yeah. Yeah. Then you also in your book describe the sort of the role and the task of the human sciences. I wonder whether we could venture a bit into that. I believe you had in the quite crucial third chapter you state, it's my contention that when we read together, as we must, history is produced on these two registers, the global regime of historicity and the planetary or the anthropocenic regime of historicity. When we read them together, the category planet emerges as a category of humanist thought.
Right.
And following also as a category of existential and therefore philosophical concerns to human.
Right.
That is a bit further.
Sure, but that is something you see in what the scientists write. So when they do their technical work and they propose something called Earth system, this entity that works like a system. But when they explain all that science for people like myself who are not scientists, so this book that I use by two scientists called Building a Habitable Planet, or any of these, Tim Lenton's book, they themselves have very human responses to the object they construct. So even we all know that science includes affect, right? I mean, when you discover something, you might feel elated. But they themselves are somewhat concerned when they realize what Earth system is and what we are doing. So in that sense, because it comes into affect, because Earth system produces emotional response in the scientists. So for me, the scientists are the first proof that their own category has a humanist side.
But I read you as stating that the role of the human sciences is more important than a simple leftover or add-on to science. It's also a basic rearticulation of what's actually taking place, what's going on, and how to understand and how to cope and relate to that.
Right, because the scientists won't do what I'm doing. I'm just giving you mentioning it as kind of that even at the level of the people who discover Earth system, it is not without human affect. And the affect is existential because it immediately gives rise to question the what should we do to survive this. So you actually, whether they talk of geoengineering, whether they talk of being reverential towards Earth, they get outside of science. And if in their own writing you can see some theological concerns coming up, right? And that's where what I do in the book. I mean, as my optimistic thing is that I say that because humans will never come under the umbrella of one rational argument, except in very temporarily in a sudden crisis. The exercise I try to do as a humanist is to follow Karl Jaspers somewhat and say, can we place ourselves in a position which is before we make our political choices, that is before we say I'm a Marxist or to be able to agree that there are these two perspectives on our lives. One is what I call global, one is called planetary. Because my hope is that if we can accept that this crisis allows us to get out of a just global perspective and develop a planetary perspective, it may help to mitigate. See, I mean, my argument is not very compatible with the geoengineering argument.
Yeah.
So if I can persuade people that we need to take another, then it becomes incompatible with the geoengineering argument, because geoengineering argument only extends the global. And intensifies it even more.
Yeah, in that sense, there will also be practical implications of what you state.
Right.
But I also read you as saying that it's also an important task for the human sciences to actually develop or study anthropological questions. At the point where we are to develop
this I take.
Who are we? Who are we in the process of becoming at this point in history where we experience this?
Actually, it's your book that helped me to think through it. I mean, your book, your short book on philosophy of the Anthropocene, where you talked about Kant's book on logic. Logic. And those, the three or the fourfold distinction he makes, where he says, when you take a fundamental problem, you can break it down into those three questions, and then they all convert into the fourth question. So the first one is, what is the problem? Or how do we know the problem? And as you say, the second one is, what can we do about it? And the third one is, what do we expect from it? Right? And then he says, but they all resolve into a fourth question, which is the human. And clearly, when you apply those questions to the climate problem, or the environmental problem, then you say, what is the problem? Scientists will tell you. What should we do about it? Activists, politicians, policy people will debate that. Do you expect? So you go to artists, you go to religious people to get a sense of what to expect. And then it all folds back into what is the human. And here I'm bringing Hannah Arendt and Kant together to say the human condition has changed. I mean, this crisis means that the human condition has changed. And one of the questions I had for myself in writing the book, I'm not claiming anything for myself, but the question that was pushing me was this, that if Hannah Arendt were alive today and was asked to update the book on the human condition, which was written when the Russian Sputnik had gone up, what would she say? So I was trying to, in a way, update Arendt's book. To say that the human condition has changed, and therefore we need to look at our position in the world differently. And in that sense, there's a new philosophical anthropology.
So in that sense, it's a modern parallel to Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition, you can say, in that sense, who rephrases the question of philosophical anthropology.
Exactly. So that's in that sense.
Time is pressing, unfortunately, but I wondered whether we could, towards this end of the talk, could raise the question of the relationship between your present work and your previous work, for example, Provincializing Europe. How would you describe this relationship?
Well, as I said, Provincializing Europe was looking at that fascinating character on the world stage called Europe. Which had a world-making function, which was both destructive and generative, and trying to think, what are the implications for lives outside of Europe, of that Europe? But I think it's precisely the Europe that I was trying to provincialize, that the world created by that Europe, the worlding function of it, that has come to an end, that is now in a crisis. See, Provincializing Europe was working with ideas of freedom, ideas of emancipation, that were connected to the Enlightenment. And these are still values that continue in our lives. They're not unimportant. But only thinking about them, while our numbers increase, our standard of living increases, we eat more, gets us into trouble. And see, what happened was, in Provincializing Europe, there was no awareness of the microbial world. So when I was writing Provincializing Europe, people were writing about animal liberation arguments were there, animal rights arguments were there. But you see, the animal rights literature always insisted on a sentience threshold, that only some animals who can anticipate pain were part of Peter Singer's argument about cruelty, stopping cruelty against animals. Even my colleague Martha Nussbaum's Tanner lectures called Frontiers of Justice, where the section on human relationship to non-human animals, and she thinks about human justice to non-human animals. The animals are not microbial. See, it's only very recently that humanists have become aware. I mean, Latour has been influenced on this, that actually the microbial forms of life are very important and even keep animal life going, because an animal's body is also a colony for microbes as much as my body is, right? So this is where we don't know how to think with human notions of justice with regard to bacteria, viruses. You can think about the rabbit, you can think about the dog, you can think about a cute animal like the polar bear, and we have often talked about the polar bear's point of view on us. But when you actually realize that the majority forms of life are sometimes not even fully living, like the viruses, you realize what a miraculous thing this life is, and how it exceeds human questions of justice, human questions of equality, inequality, all the issues that make up human politics. So once you have this knowledge, that's why I have a section in the book which I call "Thinking the Political is at the Limit of the Political." So I would say that provincializing Europe was, of course, still within the humanist framework and not engaging with this world. But what I take from provincializing Europe, what remains, for instance, I've been provincializing Europe. I had a chapter on minority histories and subaltern pasts. And now I have begun to think whether one can extend subaltern studies, some of its projects, towards the non-human. And the question of human domination of non. Think of it, I'll give you a simple example. What Europeans did with natives, for instance, by producing anthropology, history, geography, zoology, botany, they got to know the native world by producing forms of knowledge which helped to control the native worlds. So you could not separate the knowledge from the control function. Today, we know about bacteria and viruses because we want to control them. The only reason why we know so much about COVID-19 coronavirus is because it's an enemy and we have to know it. And actually, the knowledge we produce about viruses has the same form as colonial knowledge. Right? In that, except that they are more powerful than we are. And but can we think of it as colonial knowledge? Does it make, because we're not trying to colonize them, we're just saying stop them from colonizing our bodies. So so there's a biologist, a Nobel laureate, who actually said, his name escapes me now, who said, our struggle with viruses and bacteria belong to a deep, deep history of life. It in that sense, it's beyond the biopolitical. And he said that so every time we come across new viruses, bacteria, we develop new defenses, new machines, new material. And every medicine or machinery that we build to deal with bacteria, viruses, also become new paths of evolution for them. Right? So they develop new strains. There's a beautiful essay on this by Jared Diamond actually showing this. And so this Nobel laureate said, if you wrote a thriller about humans versus the bacteria and the viruses, you would have to call it their genes versus our wits. So it's human intelligence pitting itself against life. And that's not a game anybody can win in the end, because life is a much larger story. than our story. But we have no other option. So in many respects, the kind of thinking we've done with animal rights, you can't extend them to the microbial world, which is not even known. And utilitarian argument like pleasure and pain that Peter Singer uses wouldn't apply to them. So that's why I call for a new philosophical anthropology. That when you begin to realize what we are in this world, you realize that our political thought, our philosophical thought cannot capture the entirety of it.
So in that sense, we need a new political thought. But I was also thinking of, because at some point when you put out the four theses, you were criticized for defecting the critical course and maybe even defecting your own thought by introducing the Anthropocene and climate change. But one could also turn the other way around and say that it's also a continuation of critical thought, actually, to enter into the to the Anthropocene.
Because what I'm saying, what I'm doing is thinking about critical thought critically, so that it can become even more critical. So that's why in the book, as you have seen, I've got a little discussion of Adorno's negative universal history. And all that, so I put the question like this. So often, many ecological thinkers say we should give stones and rocks and trees rights. Now that's extending human notions of rights to non-humans. But a negative universal history would begin when we would be able to hear the non-human without they're having to anthropomorphize themselves. Right? They're having to bear something that we call rights. And that hasn't happened yet. And I think that's a project for the future. I think of Bruno Latour, Donna Haraway, and other people leading us that way. They're trying to lead us that way, but a lot of the thinking is still
we haven't arrived there yet.
We haven't built the bridges. No, we haven't. We haven't.
So that's
but it's a good horizon to have.
I believe we have to end now. We overstepped the framework, but I'm happy that we did so. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Can we stop the recording and talk a little bit? I just want to discuss something with you.
I just want to finish the recording just because.
Sure. Okay.
But I just first want to thank you for your willingness to take part in this conversation, deep as a public part, and then we can discuss afterwards. And it's been very interesting and fascinating, maybe also a bit anxiety-provoking and at least thought-provoking, and maybe also provoked an interest in the future because we don't know what's in the process of arriving still. I think that's. But Wednesday, the 5th of May, at 11 to 12 p.m., I continue this ongoing conversation on the Anthropocene with Professor Michel Rousseau of the École Normale Supérieure and the École Urbaine de Lyon, and also with Christian Pay, head of Oslo Architecture Triennale. And the conversation will focus on the changing role and character of urbanity, urban planning, and architecture in the Anthropocene and the Urbanocene. And I'm sure that the question of habitability will pop up again in this following conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for taking part.
No, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm very grateful. It was very good to go over these things with you.
Great.
Well, I mean, my correspondence with you has been very clarifying for me. So, and reading you has been very helpful. So,
great.
Thank you for your work.
It's been a pleasure also reading your last book in preparation for this talk.
Thank you.
But we